In the second segment of our conversation today, we'll focus on questions regarding the role religion plays in today's world. Yesterday, I received a newsletter from Idea Spektrum, a German Protestant periodical. In it, Dr. Thomas Schirmacher, a German evangelical theologian who heads the International Institute for Religious Freedom, which is part of the World Evangelical Alliance, states that about 40,000 people from non-Christian backgrounds convert to Christianity every day. That's a quite remarkable number, and I didn't have time to double check. But how is Christianity doing in the non-Western world?
Well, to give a long answer, very well. Look, these figures are pretty wild guesses. Some guesses are better than others. What we know is that Christianity is exploding in China, and evangelical Protestant, including very central component of this is evangelical, and Christianity is growing, especially Pentecostalism in Black Africa, in Latin America, and in parts of Asia, in addition to China. That much we know. The exact figures, I don't know, I'd be not negative, but we really don't know. And the reason is very simple. Religious statistics are usually not government statistics. In the United States, the census is not allowed to ask questions about religion. So you rely on what religious bureaucracies tell you. It's not that they cheat, but they don't know. People shift, they move around. We talked about that in the last session. Pentecostalism is a particular problem because much of it is local. You have big Pentecostal denominations. The Assemblies of God is one very big one, international. I like the title. A big Pentecostal group in Brazil is called the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. Okay? And they have missionaries, by the way, who come to America, especially with Brazilian immigrants. But much of it is local. It's some preacher who gets together like William Seymour, this guy in California 100 years ago. And they get some people. They meet in the evening in a garage or something. They have no address, they're not in the phone book. How are you going to count this? But the basic message here is correct. Mm-hmm. Okay?
So Christianity is doing quite well, as you said.
Yeah.
What about the influences, though? Where are the influences coming from? You said they're local. Are these local preachers, or are these preachers coming from the outside?
Well, it's different in different countries. In most of those, if you talk about evangelical Protestantism, okay? In Latin America and much of Asia, also in China, it originally came from missionaries from the West. United States very strongly. Now it's much more complicated. Next to the United States, the most important source of evangelical missionaries is South Korea. Mm-hmm. Okay? They go into China on tourist visas with a suitcase full of Bibles, and then sometimes they're thrown out. Nothing worse usually happens to them, but they're thrown out. Maybe the police beats them up before they throw them out. But even in countries where there are no foreign missionaries at all, it now has become indigenized. Now, Latin America, which I know best from our studies there, most of the preachers are local. I mean, they're natives of those countries. In fact, they send missionaries abroad, like the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So I would say, while originally the impulse has come from North America and to a lesser extent, well, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it's also Europe. Now it's become very indigenized.
And could you see a development that, missionaries now will come, missionaries, for example, to Europe will come from the Global South?
They do. Was it a year ago, a little over a year and a half ago, I gave some lectures in Dublin. Still very Catholic country, much less so as we talk, but okay. On the way back to Boston, I read the Irish Times, I think it was, and they reported the reporter was sort of puzzled and slightly supercilious about it. There was a Pentecostal rally in Dublin the previous weekend, which had 10,000 people attending. Now, they were almost all Africans, and the preacher was a Nigerian Pentecostal preacher. And the reporter from the Irish Times was particularly concerned, is this influencing white Irish people? Well, the preacher in his sermon that I read in the paper, I wasn't there, said that we are very happy to be in Ireland. It's a wonderful country. We love Ireland, and we welcome all Irish people to come to our church, regardless of race or national origin. Well, the reporter said there were a few white Irish people who came to the service, participated. He said with some pleasure they were mostly older people. This may change. And Irish Catholicism has become somewhat less attractive with all the scandals, secularity has its discontents. So when these African preachers come around, there's a possible market. Mm-hmm. If the African preachers become more educated, which is possible, more adjusted to the Irish scene, there might be an effect.
Speaking of markets, there seems to be also a market for a new theology, the so-called prosperity gospel, that seems to be doing quite well, also in the global south. How do you see that phenomenon?
Different from the way most people see it. Okay. What does the prosperity gospel essentially say? Well, there are two kinds of prosperity gospel. There are those who say, if you have faith, come to church, work hard, educate your children, God will bless you. That is not an empty promise. And you can see it in countries where, especially Pentecostalism, is recent arrival. If people follow the Pentecostal ethic, which is, what does it say? Work hard, don't drink up your weekly pay, don't have mistresses all over town if you're a man, educate your children, come home at a decent hour, talk to your wife, don't beat her up. Okay, if you live by that, you may not become wealthy, prosperous, but you are likely to work yourself out of the most desperate poverty. So that kind of prosperity gospel is true, okay? Empirically correct. Now there's another form, that's what people usually say. Right. There are these corrupt preachers who promise people if you give money and have faith, God will make you rich. You don't have to do anything else. You can live the way you live now, just give us, tithe your income and support the church and pray to God. You'll be rich. Well, that, I would say, empirically is a false promise, okay? The question is, what is the percentage of these two groups? And what I have seen of Pentecostalism in global South countries, the first group is more significant. Also, it's the only group that's going to have an effect. Because, I'm sorry, I don't believe that if you have faith and give money to the preacher, you'll become rich. I don't think that's going to happen, okay? But if you follow that ethic, there may be some very visible results, and you can see them. So, mention Brazil. There now is a new Protestant middle class, mainly in Pentecostal churches. So some are gravitating to more mainline churches. That's a new phenomenon. And it has something to do with that ethic. Max Weber wrote about it over 100 years ago. And I think he was right in terms of the origins of modern capitalism. And you can see it in places like that.
Mm-hmm. So obviously it's the more significant phenomenon, but this other phenomenon still, remains. But are you concerned about it? About this I guess you could call it a heresy of that other prosperity gospel that promises riches by simply believing?
I'm not very concerned about it. Nothing's going to happen to these people. I'm sorry about that. But some of the preachers believe that themselves. Look, we had, when I say we, it's not the royal we, our research center had a whole series of Pentecostal studies. Our penultimate one was in South Africa. We had a very interesting study in South Africa. Our researchers decided that 1 in 5 South Africans today is Pentecostal. So it's incredible. Population of about, 50 million. I flunked arithmetic in grade school, so I can't figure this out quickly. What's 5% of 20% of 50 million? Anyway, 1/5, 10 million.
Good. We have some math majors here, I'm sure.
Why did I mention this? Okay. One of the questions that people asked, it was a survey type study, asked of the respondents, are you optimistic about the future? Do you think your children will have a better life than you have? Do you think you have a chance of improving your own life? Well, the Pentecostals, compared to their neighbors who were not Pentecostal, were much more optimistic about the future, self-reliant, taking an initiative. That's enormously important. Now, if they simply, and it may change their lives. The others who simply give money and expect a miracle, I don't think anything's going to happen. So am I concerned about it? Yes, but...
Not to such an extent. Okay, fair enough. Now let's move to the States and talk about the Western world and especially the United States. When it comes to American culture, has American culture completely transformed Christianity in the 20th century? As Alan Wolfe suggested about 10 years ago in his book, The Transformation of American Religion?
Anything Alan Wolfe said, I wouldn't take very seriously. He doesn't understand religion. Of course, America has changed things, and I don't know from where you want to date it. I mean, America changed the nature of Christianity from the Puritans who came to Massachusetts, and ever since then, and has had a number of effects. I mean, and pluralism has been one of the most important. How has it changed in recent decades? Well, I mentioned one thing, the change in the status of Pentecostals. I don't know what you have what would you have in mind?
I could, for example, think of literature.
I'm sorry, I mean the change in the status of evangelicals. I misspoke.
Right.
Because I talked about the new evangelical intelligentsia. And yeah.
But in evangelical churches, for example, I think one could make the case that popular culture has not just creeped in, but it has really transformed many churches that, for example, worship songs. Many churches are now still debating, should we have more worship songs, should they be hymns, and so forth. Has the church become juvenile? That is it only attracting to the youth culture? Is it indistinguishable from pop culture?
Well, look, I mean, mainline Protestantism has, I don't know, I would say probably since the early years of the 20th century, maybe 1920s, 1930s, I'm not a church historian, but has become, Thomas Luckmann years ago, I think I mentioned that earlier, has spoken of secularization from within, and has become heavily politicized in a left of center direction. Much of it is psychology, psychotherapy in a way. Religion is good for you, makes you healthier, happier, whatever. And more morally, I mean, Nancy Ammerman, a colleague at Boston University, was a good sociologist of religion, very empirically oriented, has coined a very nice term, golden rule Christianity, okay? What Christianity is all about is the golden rule. Now, I don't think that's what Christianity is all about, or has been about traditionally. Sure, the golden rule is important, but Christianity has a heavy supernaturalist, I would say, cosmic message. And I would say that has much to do with the decline of mainline Protestantism. This loss of the core of what used to be the Christian message. And in a self-defeating way, I recently looked it up. I was surprised how long ago this was. In 1972, a guy by the name of Dean Kelly, who was actually a liberal Protestant, he was an official he was sort of a researcher for the National Council of Churches, main liberal Protestant bastion. And he wrote a book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. And that's what he said. He said, look, if you want to be a liberal activist, you can work for the Democratic Party, for a number of organizations, NGOs, whatever. You don't need the Presbyterian Church to do that, okay? So if the Presbyterian Church, you can name some other denomination if you like, is all about that, it is putting itself out of business. It's a self-destructive course. And Kelly, I don't know, he must be dead by now. He was a fairly elderly gentleman, I remember, when he wrote the book. His message, he didn't like what he found. His group wasn't doing well, and he predicted that this would continue. He was right. So that's been a significant change. Will this change? I don't know. If we had had all the methods of modern social science in the early 16th century, would we have predicted the Reformation? Probably not. Okay? And there was this, as a Lutheran, I speak in an amused way about my own group. There was this slightly neurotic monk in his cell in the Augustinian monastery, well, in Erfurt, I think, worrying about he was worthy of God's grace. And then all kinds of other things happened, and this became a very significant social movement, which in the end split Western Europe into two. Okay, I don't think anyone would have predicted that.
Well, we're already in Europe, in Germany, but let's talk about the EU for a moment, and let's talk about the fact that even though the word God cannot be found in the EU constitution or the treaties, Europe has become a defender of human rights, more so I would say than the United States, and human dignity. But when it comes to human dignity, the notion of human dignity, doesn't the notion of human dignity presuppose a theological framework?
I don't think so. Look, I think I can address this theologically if you like, but I think I'm being invited here mainly as a sociologist. Sure, the notions of human rights as they will be propagated by the EU and the United States has a Christian history behind it. Historically, in a way you could say it is a secularization of what was Christian morality. But it is now possible to divorce it from Christian morality. And let me give an example. We still have a little time. I like to tell stories. Okay?
That's fine.
Some years ago I was in London, and I wanted to buy the English translation of an Indian novel written in an indigenous language. And somebody told me there was an Indian bookstore in Bloomsbury, and told me how to get there from my hotel. And I didn't find that bookstore. I got lost. And then I discovered, I had never been there before, that almost around the corner from that bookstore was the Old British Museum, before it moved across the river to wherever it is now, where Karl Marx brooded and wrote Das Kapital. Okay? So there was British. Now I knew how to get to the British Museum. And some more recent visit, I had to take somebody there, and I knew how to go there. Now, I found the British Museum via looking for this Indian bookstore. Now, if I want to go to the British Museum, I don't have to go via the Indian bookstore. Okay? I think that basic notions of human rights, human dignity, are not just moral teachings, they are perceptions. You see a human being and say, you realize this human being has intrinsic and inviolate rights. It's a perception. You don't have to be a Christian or a religious person to have that perception now. Now, and that, what I'm saying now could be elaborated theologically. If you are a Christian, then this perception is cosmically grounded. You say, it's not just a prejudice of mind that human beings have these rights. I perceived it, say, before I was a Christian, before I became religious. But what I now, as a Christian, I put this into a framework that involves the entire universe. God also has created human beings as having these indigenous intrinsic rights. That's a different thing from saying you have to be a Christian in order to have belief in human rights. It's a perception, not a doctrine.
But, I mean, could you make the counter-argument too that perceptions are very subjective and could change any time? So could you say, I mean, how could one argue from a secular point of view that human dignity is, ja, die Menschenwürde kann nicht angerührt werden? Also,
I don't know what argument you can make. You can say, look at this. I'll show you. I'll give you a favorite example. This has come up before in conversations of mine. Many of you, I'm sure, have read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Remember, Huck is, I forget why, he's drifting on a raft down the Mississippi. And this other character, an escaped slave by the name of Jim, somehow gets on his raft. And Huck knows he's an escaped slave. Now, Huck is in Twain's novel, a true son of the South. And he knows his conscience, formed by his upbringing, tells him, this man is somebody's property. I ought to turn him over to the authorities so he can be restored to his owner. And then he finds he cannot do this. Why? Somehow he now perceives Jim on that raft, in a somewhat unusual situation, is a human being. He's not just somebody's property. I cannot turn him over. Now, he didn't read an abolitionist tract. He did, I mean, it's a fictitious character, but it's a revealing story. He wasn't listened to some propagandist. He didn't read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. No, it was suddenly a perception. Here is a human being, and a human being should not be somebody else's property. Okay? That's what I mean. And now a French sociologist, a good French sociologist, has coined the term the ecumenism of human rights. And all over the world, people who are not converts to Christianity suddenly share this perception. A very significant fact. So people now are sensitive to these issues in a way they were not before. Which I think is a very good thing.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Europe, I came across a very interesting, provocative quote from the most recent issue of Books and Culture. Ted Malloch, a research professor at Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and also a Gordon alum, and he was here, I guess, in the fall of last year. He claims that, and I quote, practicing Christianity in Europe today enjoys a status of not dissimilar to smoking marijuana or engaging in unorthodox sexual activities. Would you agree with that statement?
It's an exaggeration. Quite an exaggeration. I mean, you can say that some aspects of religion are countercultural in Europe now. I mean, It raises eyebrows. I mean, but less so, I think, than it did a few years ago.
Hasn't religion moved to the public square in Europe? I mean, that's also my perception, that one can talk about religion without being questioned. Can you really do this in the public square? I think it's when you, for example, read newspapers, highbrow newspapers like Die Zeit in Germany, the Hamburg Weekly, they now have a section on faith and doubt. That was unthinkable about, I guess, 10 years ago. It's a fairly recent section, the part of the newspaper.
Well, certainly the religious scene in Europe has become much more diverse. And you may know the Austrian sociologist Paul Zulehner, his most recent book. It's difficult to translate into English. It's a survey-type study in Austria, and he calls it Verbuntung, which literally means making more colorful. Said religion has become more colorful in Austria. The same is true throughout Europe. So it's no longer just are you Catholic or Protestant or agnostic. There are all kinds of other things around. Give an example. I was in Germany a few years ago at a party in Stuttgart, and it was near Stuttgart, and for some reason people talked about an Indian guru, and I knew about him. And I said, I think this is rather fraudulent. He's supposed to have performed certain miracles. And next to me sat a middle-aged, a young middle-aged, a man in his 30s, spoke with a thick Swabian accent, who said, I'm a follower of this guru. Okay, I mean, that becomes more colorful. You have Buddhists in Norway, I mean, this kind of thing. So I think the European scene has become much more diverse, mainly through migration, but also through Swabians who follow an Indian guru. Makes it more interesting, actually.
Well, since we're already talking about other religions, let's talk about Islam for a moment. Yesterday, obviously, we commemorated the events of September 11th, 2001. And since 9/11 especially, the West has had a very hard time with Islam in general and with the integration of Muslim minorities into Western societies. Last year, when German Chancellor Merkel stated that Islam was part of Germany, many Germans, including politicians of her own conservative party, were up in arms. How do you see the relationship between Islam and the West today?
Look, I mean, every study I know of Islam in any part of the world makes clear that radical Islamist, terrorist type of Islam is a minority among Muslims. Most Muslims and most people who go through a kind of revival of Islam in their own lives are not radical, are not terrorists. They have found in Islam meaning in life and guidance in how to live. Now, the ones who are radical are very dangerous, as we have found. And one has to take that seriously. So if people say, should one be afraid of Islam, it's not easy to say simply no. Somebody in France wrote a book about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, should one be afraid of Islam? And she said no. Well, it'd be a little more difficult to say this now. We have reason to be afraid of a certain kind of Islam, which is going to grow. And much will depend on events that have nothing to do with religion, economic and political events. This week has been a very significant week. The rapid decline of American power in the Middle East, which I think now is going to have catastrophic development, is going to be a factor. Radical Islamists are winning a very significant victory. That has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with political events.
So how could one counter that, making sure that the American presence in the Middle East remains stable? Or?
Well, I don't know, I can't give recommendations to the American government, there are certain things that have happened which shouldn't have happened. And look, I don't want to make political statements here. Just objectively speaking, the events in Syria and how the Syrian thing is now developing, how the Egyptian thing is developing, how Turkey is developing, has much to do with the decline of American power. And that will influence, it will be an enormous encouragement to radical Islam. Now, apart from that, there are economic factors. Muslim countries have, I think it's fair to say, the highest birth rate in the world. They have lousy educational systems and very fragile economies. So what do you have? You have enormous masses of young people, especially young men. They're the ones who are most likely to become terrorists or radicals, who are unemployed and unemployable. That's a very serious fact. It's a market for every radical movement. So a combination of political and economic factors, in this case demographic factors, will influence what happens in Islam as a religion. I'm very concerned about it. I have no silver bullets on how to deal with it.
All right, let's talk about Christianity again, but we've talked a lot about evangelicalism, Pentecostalism. Let's talk about the Catholic Church for a change. The Catholic Church has there's a new pope, obviously, and looking back, how do you view Benedict's papacy, and how do you view his successor, Pope Francis?
Well, I think the change is less radical than many Catholic conservatives fear and Catholic progressives hope. Obviously, very different personalities, and I haven't met him. I met Benedict when he was still a cardinal. I liked him, very interesting man. We didn't talk about theology, but what we did talk about is very open-minded, very well-educated, very modest in the way he expressed his opinions. Francis is a different kind of person, much more emotional, much warmer personality, apparently. I think he's not going to make very radical changes in the church. He's not a liberation theologian. He says the church has to be concerned for the poor. You don't have to be a liberation theologian to say that. He said kind things about gays, and, but when you get to basic questions, he's a conservative Catholic. And things like, ordination of women, this kind of thing, married clergy, I don't think there are going to be any great changes. There is a demographic factor which will be particularly significant in Europe, that there is an increasing shortage of priests, and with results that are very serious. I mean, lots of churches have to be closed, put together, and happened in Vienna recently. That will force some changes. I don't think it will mean married clergy. I don't think it will mean women priests. What it might mean is an expansion of the diaconate to emphasize, allow more women. That could happen without radical changes. Mm-hmm. And some change will have to happen, because you can't have one priest taking care of 3,000 people. And the supply of priests from outside Europe, Poland used to be a big source, it's less and less, Ireland less and less. How many African priests can you import into Italy? I mean, I don't know.
Speaking of change, I don't know if you've heard or read about Helmut Schüller, a very progressive Austrian Catholic priest, very progressive and also very controversial because of his progressive nature. He just toured the United States, promoting disobedience. Do you see him as a troublemaker, a lone troublemaker, or do you see a real reform movement behind him? In other words, do you envision, maybe not under Francis, but maybe a different pope, that the Catholic Church will in fact change, that celibacy won't be an issue anymore, that priests will be able to marry, and that there will be more radical changes well beyond Vatican II.
Catholic Church tends to change slowly. Vatican II was a rather massive change over a short period of the Council, with great effects. I don't know if they can afford a similarly strong change anytime soon. This was a big enough change as it was, as it is. I hesitate to make predictions. Mm-hmm. Most predictions that I have made as a sociologist have turned out to be wrong. But what's very significant is the shift of the center of the demographic center of Christianity from north to south, and that's true of every, well, certainly true of the Catholic Church. And there are differences. Now, both African Christianity, African Catholicism, Latin American Catholicism is much more robustly supernaturalist than European. Miracles, exorcism, is much more accepted. That's going to influence the Church, I think, even at its center. Also much more permissive in many ways in terms of sexual morality. It may influence the center, I don't know. I mean, issues like same-sex marriage and I don't want to predict. Everything changes. Catholic Church has had a genius in making changes and pretending that it hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. Because supposedly the truth is always the same. Well, it may be, but there have been lots of changes. And it may be forced to make changes by politics, by demography, by migration.
I have one last question for you, and that too is a question about the future. And of course, you know, we don't perceive you necessarily as a prophet. I don't know if you think you have that particular gift of prophecy, but you know, every religious group is wondering about the future, and nobody really knows. And so, of course, Catholics are thinking about the future. Evangelicals are thinking about our future, and evangelicals in the West are thinking a lot about questions surrounding human sexuality. And it was recently announced at that Fuller Theological Seminary, as the first evangelical seminary, will accept an LGBT group on campus. What do you think? Will Fuller remain the only evangelical seminary? Will there be others? What about evangelical colleges such as Gordon College? How do you envision the future of evangelicalism when it comes to human sexuality and other issues?
Look, the sexual revolution, so-called, that gathered steam in the 60s and 70s, is going to be very difficult to reverse. For a very simple reason, because lots of people enjoy it. And when you take away candy from a child and say this was bad that you liked the candy, you're not going to have any more candy, the child is going to get angry. So I think reversing this sexual revolution totally is going to be very difficult. And I would predict that more conservative churches will have to, how should I say, to loosen up a bit on some of these issues. That doesn't mean they have to loosen up completely. It's very interesting, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, what's his name? Webley? Yeah. Must be an interesting man. And the Parliament has now legalized same-sex marriage in Great Britain, or at least in England, I guess Great Britain. And Cameron wants to show Prime Minister how progressive the Tory party is. No more Colonel Blimp, it's now same-sex marriage. And the pressure on, well, the Catholics aren't going to accept that for a long time. The Church of England was more nervous about it. And the Archbishop, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, made a very interesting statement. He says, we are not going to change our conception of marriage, which is a lifelong union of one man and one woman. Now, the divorce has been more acceptable, but basically it's one man and one woman, and the intention is it should last for a lifetime. Okay? And they produce children, which only a man and a woman together can do. At least for now. I don't know what they're going to invent with artificial insemination in the future. But well, they can still do some of it now. But anyway, we're not going to change our position on this. However, we are not going to now oppose the law. They could. I mean, the bishops still sit in the House of Lords. They could start a big campaign against this. They'd probably lose in England. They said, we're not going to do this. It's a law of the land. We don't like it. We obey it. But we're not going to allow this with church blessing. So if you want to be married in an Anglican church, you better be a man and a woman, period. And if you are two men or two women, go somewhere else. You can now do it legally. That's a very sensible position.
Do you think evangelicals will find similar sensible positions?
I can't predict, but I would say there'll be pressures in that direction, yeah. Look, I mean, one thing that's happening, and I'm sorry I come back to pluralism, it's my obsession. It's not an obsession, I view things now through the prism of my theory of pluralism. One thing that pluralism does, it forces every tradition, because it's under these pressures, cognitive pressures, to distinction between what is its core and what are more negotiable issues. What is the core of my faith, which I'm not going to give up, okay? And what is more peripheral? That's a very healthy process. And people can come out with different conclusions. Now, well, at the time of Galileo, the Catholic Church, at least significant, the Inquisition certainly, felt that the notion that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around is heretical on whatever grounds. Well, they gave that up. I don't think it affected the core of Catholic faith. In the case of evangelicals, well, I guess, yeah, creationism comes close to what was believed before Copernicus. But that, I don't think, can stand. But I think relatively, in my knowledge, relatively few evangelicals regard rejection of evolution as the core of their faith. I think this can be negotiated or given up without affecting the core. So every tradition, and in a way every individual who's a believer, has to decide what is the core of my faith and what can I safely abandon. Let me end on since this is a Christian college, how much time do we have left?
Well, we still have some time for questions, but...
Okay, let me end with what has a theological implication. What is the core of the faith, as I understand it? But it's not Lutheran, it comes from Russia. Eastern Orthodox. The story is, maybe true, maybe not. In any case, I think it's true. I read it as an account of something. During the Soviet times, you had constant atheistic propaganda campaigns by the Communist Party. And these commissars, agitprop officers they called them, went around the country and taught people the truth of materialism and atheism. And the story is that in one village, all the villagers had to listen to a 2-hour lecture by a commissar on scientific atheism. And then he said, well, we believe in free discussion here, which of course wasn't true, but still he said it. We'll give 5 minutes to the priest, Orthodox priest, for a rebuttal. So the Orthodox priest went in front, turned to the villagers, and said, Christ is risen. And the villagers responded with a liturgical formula, "He's risen indeed." And the priest went back to his people. I don't know what happened afterwards. He may have been arrested or not, but that's the story as I heard it. That, I think, is the core of the Christian gospel. Now, obviously, lots of questions. Who is Christ? What is the resurrection? What does it mean for us? That's besides the point. That is the core. If you give that up, you give up the whole story. But there are lots of other things which are of a different nature. Now, stay with the resurrection. However you interpret what happened in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, that is central. Christ is risen. The other miracles of the New Testament, did they happen literally or not? I don't know. I think many things happen that we don't easily understand. Did Jesus walk on Lake Galilee on the water? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't think that's a core issue. And I'm relaxed about it. Whether some of these miracles happened, whether some of them didn't happen, and they're just nice stories with some lesson perhaps, I don't think that touches the core of my faith. Similar questions can be asked, I think, have to be asked by almost everyone. And it's a question that Muslims have to ask, Catholics have to ask. I'll stop now. You.
Thank you. Speaking of questions, this is time now for you to ask questions. And we have microphones again for you. We have one question, Suzanne, and Professor Phillips in the front.
From every direction. This is great. Dr. Berger, thank you for your comments. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to listen to you. I was wondering if you could talk about the situation in Egypt. How that looks through a sociologist's eyes.
Well, look, the 1 year of the presidency of Mr. Morsi was a disaster. The military coup may have been inevitable. The brutality which the military now had is another story. What we should do about it in terms of American policy, I frankly don't know. Well, I think that's another issue which I don't want to get into, this complicated issue. But what's very relevant to what we've been talking about here this afternoon, a new Egyptian constitution is being formed now by a committee which the military regime has set up. As far as I know, there is no Muslim-majority country, except maybe Bosnia-Herzegovina, which doesn't, I'm not sure about that, which doesn't have in its constitution the statement that the religion of the state is Islam. The question is, what does that mean? That's a very interesting question. The constitution that the Morsi government pushed through with a committee that was totally dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, they didn't let anybody else in, they also said, they had the formula, legislation in Egypt should be determined by Islamic principles, without an explanation what that means. The Morsi constitution had an explanation. They said this means that legislation should be based on particular judgments of Islamic courts, that is, fatwas under Sharia law. It's very specific. If you steal something, your right hand is going to be cut off. If you repeat it, your left leg is going to be cut off. And other perhaps not perhaps, less bloodthirsty rules. Under the new constitution, as apparently now, they're going to leave Islamic principles without that specification. Now that can be interpreted very differently. Not specific judgments of Islamic courts, but principles like justice, compassion, concern for the poor, whatever else. A list of moral precepts that are, they say, Islamic principles. The question is, which of these is going to win out? Now, the military is going to force through its constitution now. All the opponent leaders are in prison. And Morsi is God knows where, also in some kind of prison. But will this stick? And there are very similar questions in other Muslim majority countries. And how this is decided will be very important, not only for Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, but for the rest of us. Most of us, I think, in the West would opt for, okay, let's say Islamic principles, but don't go to specific fatwas.
Hi. You mentioned that in Europe, when Christianity was connected to state religions, it's caused kind of a decline in Christianity. So if Islamic countries adopt Islam as a state religion, will it cause a decline, like a similar decline, or?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the rest of what you said.
So if Middle Eastern countries adopt Islam as a state religion, will there be a similar decline in Islam like there is in Europe because of the connection between the state and the religion?
Well, it depends how that formula of Islamic principles will be interpreted. And if it's interpreted in a way which probably now will be forced through in Egypt, it may not succeed elsewhere, like Pakistan, for example, or Afghanistan, heaven help us, is going to make a very big difference. Look, a comparison, say, with Catholicism. The last time that an attempt was made to really enforce Catholicism as the religion of the state was in Franco Spain. That collapsed as Spain opened itself up to the rest of Europe, originally for economic reasons. Compare this with Christian democracy as it developed in Europe after World War II, in Western Europe, much under Catholic influences. This was not at all Catholicism should become a state religion. It was Catholic or Christian, they would even say Catholic, they said Christian principles, like the welfare state, concern for the poor, individual liberty, dignity of the person. That's a very, very different thing. And, well, Vatican II was very important here. Catholic Church nowhere in the world is, in the foreseeable future, is going to do something like happened under Franco.
Actually, I have another question too, if it's okay. Are you familiar with the new evangelization in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, well, Benedict.
Yeah, and what is your view of that? Does it look like it's succeeding or not?
Well, look, I'm not a Catholic. What should I say? Well, the Catholic Church should have this campaign. I teach in Texas 3 times a year, so I tend to use Texan phrases. I have no dog in this fight. Okay? But look, this is mainly targeted to Europe. Okay, so what Benedict, I think, had mainly in mind was the recapture of Europe by Christian values, and as proposed by the Catholic Church. Is that going to happen? There may be some moves in that direction, and it might be influenced by what the Church does. I mean, if people right now in many European countries associate the Church with what? Sex scandals, lecherous priests, corrupt curia officials. Now that's unfair in a way because it's a very small number of people guilty of this, but it's the image. If the Church manages to project a more favorable image, more likable image, yes, this could influence what is already a slight trend in the direction of a new, well, you mentioned that, and I think someone else mentioned it, and greater respect for religion. Yeah. You know what? When we talk about predictions, what's his name? Herman Kahn, who was, this was a long time ago, after World War II, he was the founder of American futurology. And they had this institute, I think it still exists, the Hudson Institute came out of that. It's a big think tank in Washington. They don't do this anymore, but Kahn used the term surprise-free future. He would predict what was a surprise-free future. In other words, a future where present trends continue. Well, we know there are lots of surprises. Some of them very nasty, some of them maybe good ones. It's very difficult to predict the future. And to assume that present trends will continue unchanged is dangerous. Danger is the wrong word. It's iffy, it's shaky.
We have time for one more question. There's one in the back.
I think this sort of has to do maybe with what you're going to speak about tomorrow, about Pentecostalism, but you've mentioned it today too. So wondering if, I know that many people or scholars in the academy treat Pentecostalism as a function of economics, something that poor and those who are suffering cling to for hope. And just wondering if, because you were at the forefront of calling the whole secularization theory false in the several decades ago, when people were predicting that religion would completely die out. It hasn't done that. In fact, it's just the opposite. But as the world becomes more prosperous, if it can sustainably be prosperous, will in the longer term, potentially, do you see religion sort of dying out as people become more comfortable, self-sufficient? And is it truly, what do you respond, what is your response to the argument that currently this rise of Pentecostalism is because of economic turmoil, and as soon as prosperity hits, the religious aspect will kind of calm down, die off?
Well, there's one American, I think he's a political scientist whose name escapes me now, who has done lots of survey research around the world, and his argument in religion and other things, values, what's his name, begins with an I. And he works together with a woman, I think at Harvard, by the name of Pippa Norris. Who? Engelhardt and Norris. Okay. Engelhardt and Norris. I don't forget Engelhardt's first name, but Norris's first name is Pippa, lady researcher. They argued that the data show that the more prosperous, answer to your question, country, the less religious. I've looked at some of this. They make some terrible misinterpretations. They interpret Japan as falling in that category, which is crazy if you know anything about Japan. It's full of religious movements. I think what they were basically studying was Europe and its extensions and influence. Okay, I don't want to criticize these people. They're honest researchers. I disagree with their conclusion. In terms of your question, is it likely that as countries become more prosperous, they will become less religious? I don't see any evidence of that. If you take America, rather important example, apart from the fact that we're sitting in this country, there's been a steady increase in church membership and church activity over the history of the United States. When America began, let's say, late 18th century, early 19th century, most of it was dreadfully poor, desperately poor. Certain areas were less poor than others, but certain areas were terribly poor. America became much more prosperous. At the same time, it became more religious. So the thesis that with prosperity religion declines has an assumption that people are most likely to be religious when they are miserable. And I don't think that's correct. People who are prosperous want somebody to thank for their prosperity. Somebody said the trouble with atheists, they can never thank anybody for anything that happens to them, other than, I don't know, their wives perhaps. Or, I don't think it's true. I don't know if I answered your question. I tried.
Well, thank you. Speaking of thankfulness, we're very thankful for you, Professor Berger, for coming here.